All right, thank you everyone for tuning into this Meet the Author interview. Today we have Dr. Kevin Clancy with us. Dr. Kevin Clancy is a postdoctoral research fellow at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School. His research aims to identify and investigate the neurophysiological mechanisms of post-traumatic stress disorder using multimodal neuroimaging and neuromodulation techniques. Today, we're chatting with Dr. Clancy about his recent paper published in NPP entitled Circulating PACAP Levels are Associated with Increased Amygdala-Default Mode Network Resting State Connectivity in Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder.
So, Kevin, I was wondering if you could tell us about Paycap and why you chose to investigate the system.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for the question. And thanks so much for having me. This is exciting for me. So Paycap, or also known as like the pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide, is a peptide that's really well validated with regards to its roles of like stress-related processes. And it's the focus of our Spared Connie Research Center here at McLean, which is led by Doctors Carrie Ressler and Bill Carlizon. Now, there's been a lot of really excellent translational work to demonstrate its role in stress and arousal through its effects on signaling in the amygdala complex, which a lot of people know is like the hub of this sort of canonical threat circuit that's implicated in stress-related disorders like PTSD. And in humans, some really seminal work by Doctors Carrie Ressler, Jennifer Stevens, our colleagues John Hammock, Victor May, they've demonstrated that Paycap system may play a critical role in the pathophysiology of PTSD, specifically through its effects on these like threat and hyperarousal related processes that are mediated by the amygdala. So kind of like a simplified takeaway is that the Paycap system may confer risk to PTSD through its effects on amygdala signaling and subsequent like threat arousal related behaviors and processes. But most of the work in humans has really looked at the system in response to some sort of stimuli. So little remain known kind of about the effects of Paycap on this sort of like intrinsic wiring of systems, which is something I love to focus on and was one of the motivating factors for this specific study.
So with that said, I think this leads us to our next question, which is what is the default mode network? And can you tell us more about the mechanisms underlying PTSD or how it's associated with PTSD?
Exactly. Yeah. So like speaking of this intrinsic wiring, the DMN or default mode network is really kind of this dominant pattern of intrinsic functional connectivity or wiring in the human brain, meaning that it's like the dominant pattern of activity at rest. And now initially it was thought to just kind of reflect like this passive idling state where not much was really going on. However, more recently, it's been shown to actually support some of like the highest levels of cognition, like self-referential thought, autobiographical memory, future planning, for example. And it's also believed to provide this sort of functional architecture or scaffolding, if you will, of the human brain through which a lot of other different systems or processes can emerge, like arousal, attention, sensory processing. It provides kind of like this homeostatic balance across these systems. And we tend to actually see cracks in this sort of scaffolding in PTSD, where the default mode network shows a pattern of hypoconnectivity or disconnectivity within itself, and then also exaggerated or hyperconnectivity with other systems, specifically arousal systems like the salience network, for example. And now what's interesting is that the amygdala is actually a hub of the salience network, and intrinsic connectivity between the amygdala and the default mode network has been demonstrated by some excellent work like Dr. Ruth Linnaeus and others to play a really critical role in PTSD and more generally just kind of like states of anxious arousal. So really for this study, we wanted to kind of combine these two lines of work, the role of Paycap and PTSD through these amygdala-mediated arousal processes, and then this intrinsic coupling that we see in PTSD between the amygdala and the default mode network. Really to kind of see if like this Paycap system is a potential candidate mechanism for this amygdala-DMN kind of circuitry that we're seeing in PTSD.
So your work also identified some really interesting sex differences. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and tell us why that's important?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to start off with that by like just kind of like this disclaimer that our sample size or our sample was like very heavily skewed, with participants assigned female at birth. So our sample sizes or the nature of our sample didn't allow for super rigorous or valid kind of investigations into sex differences. So everything I'm about to say, take with a grain of salt. We kind of tried to emphasize that in the paper. But our findings did align with a lot of very well-controlled, very well-validated studies demonstrating that the Paycap system is sensitive to estrogen, and its effects on arousal-related processes in PTSD may be unique to those who are assigned female at birth. And our data aligned with this. We found that the circulating Paycap levels were only associated with this amygdala-default mode network connectivity in participants assigned female at birth, providing yet another kind of piece to this puzzle of these sex differences. And I think this is really exciting because PTSD disproportionately affects females. However, the mechanisms driving that sex difference are kind of unclear. Like we don't really exactly know biologically why that happens. So our spared Conti research group has been examining the Paycap system as a potential mechanism for these sex differences that we do see in PTSD risk.
So how do you think this work might contribute to improve clinical outcomes for patients suffering from PTSD, or some of the translational relevance of this overall?
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is it's a small piece, but I think an important piece of like this bigger puzzle of PTSD risk and like the maintenance of its symptoms. I think what's unique about these findings is that it joins together two really powerful and well-established line of works that were previously kind of like operating in parallel or independent of each other. These lines of work being like the molecular mechanisms of PTSD with the Paycap system, amygdala, and then the kind of more circuit or network level mechanisms of PTSD with the amygdala-default mode network. So I think together this may help us identify kind of a more comprehensive biological model of the like pathogenesis of PTSD, like what's going on that confers risk or ultimately ends up the development of the disorder. And perhaps even more specific insights into why we see these sex differences clinically, phenomenologically. I think with this model, then we also might be able to develop, say, novel pharmacological interventions that target the Paycap system, the amygdala, more mechanism-informed neuromodulation strategies or treatments targeting this amygdala-DMN circuit, or maybe even combining them both. Trying to either prevent or treat PTSD in this really truly like mechanism-informed way.
That's really interesting and exciting. Speaking of future directions, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now, both inside the lab and outside the lab?
Yeah, thank you. I love that question, kind of combining these both inside and outside. So in the lab right now, I'm starting to look at other arousal systems. As it relates to trauma, the Paycap system, neural network dysfunction. Specifically right now, I'm using some really cool, what's called neuromelanin sensitive MRI sequences to image what's called like the locus coeruleus, which is a brainstem structure that's a key player in the brain's arousal system. I'm also looking more into this idea of like the functional organization of these neural networks in the brain. Mapping out some of the gradients of these cortical hierarchies and how like a breakdown in this gradient or this organization may drive certain trauma symptoms. I'm hoping that this will lead to a program of research that can combine like endogenous neurotransmitter systems with more exogenous brain stimulation and neuromodulation to correct some of these like aberrant neural circuitries that we see in trauma-related disorders. And then as you mentioned, like outside of the lab, so as a clinical psychologist, like I'm a really big advocate for also doing work outside of the lab. And I've been really, really fortunate over the past now 3-4 years now to be involved with the Syrian American Medical Society, and more recently, like kind of an offshoot NGO called Reaching Across Borders, where we're developing and implementing some psychosocial support programs for Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I actually just got done analyzing our first big wave of outcome data from our pilot program. And we're seeing some really remarkable outcomes with the program that we developed. Really great clinical improvements in children and their caregivers, which I think speaks to the incredible work that our peer specialists are doing on the ground over there. So please, anybody watching or listening, check them out, Reaching Across Borders. We would love your support and input on all that. So.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Clancy. If you haven't already, please check out the article by Dr. Clancy titled Circulating PACAP Levels Are Associated with Increased Amygdala-Default Mode Network Resting State Connectivity and Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. This paper is linked in the video description below, and please feel free to comment or reach out on Twitter if you have any questions. Thank you so much again, Dr. Clancy.
Thank you.